Hello, the purpose of today's lecture is to move through some historical developments in the study of organizations so that we can better analyze, lead, and fix, and even participate in organizations as they move towards our goals. So, while the ultimate goal of this class is how to organize positive social change, we need to start back at the beginning of how to organize, right? So, we're going to discuss 4 basic historical movements of the study of organizations and what some of those things reveal about the nature of organized life. So let's start first at the beginning. Early studies of organizational communication saw organizations as mechanisms. Basically, they looked at the way people got together, and they saw a couple of things. One is they saw that there was hierarchy, and they believed that the purpose of that hierarchy, strictly enforced, was to maximize the efficiency of that organization. And I just gave you the second keyword, efficiency. The purpose of early studies of organizations was asking this question, which is, how can we make it better? How can we make it run more smoothly? How can we improve it overall? Now, before the study of organizations, certainly people thought about it. You know, kings thought about how to run their kingdoms, generals thought about how to run their armies, merchants thought about how to run their caravans. But really, it took the turn of the 19th century, the 20th century, the 1900s, with the rise of the social scientific methods in general, for a guy named Frederick Taylor to come up with this notion of scientific management. And scientific management is pretty much what it sounds like. It's approaching the question of management from a scientific perspective, which is to say that looking at the tasks that you as a manager have to give your employees and trying to figure out a way that they can most efficiently do them. So for Taylor, he was looking at, say, factories. The classic example is this. You've got a bunch of guys with a bunch of different shovels, all shoveling coal into the engine. And Taylor comes along and he watches them, and he studies how much coal this guy shovels in a day, and how much coal this guy shovels in a day. Now, some of the guys have got huge shovels, and they're like launching the stuff in. Other people have medium-sized shovels. Other people have super small shovels. So Taylor, is measuring. He's watching the piles of coal go down, and he realizes that the guys with the huge shovels move a lot more coal in the beginning of the day, but they ultimately wipe themselves out, and they're pretty useless during the end of the day. So that one doesn't work. And the little shovels, those guys are throwing it in, all day long, but it doesn't get as much. And there's actually a shovel size that's better for throwing the coal in the fire so it can, power the engine that produces the stuff in the factory. That there's a particular size and shape of shovel that's best. That at its heart is this question of scientific management, or how can I better discover the best practices and then implement those things. So an example of mechanistic theory is the work of Henry Fayol. And Fayol came up with a bunch of different principles for what excellent management were, but they break down into 4 categories, more or less. Fayol taught about structure, power, reward, and attitude. Structure, power, reward, and attitude. So for Fayol, he theorized that a scalar chain or a strict hierarchy was the best way that organizational communication should flow. So you are allowed to talk to your boss, but you're not allowed to talk to your boss's boss or the coworker of your boss. That all information traveled up the chain, you can talk to your coworkers, so it can travel a little like this to the people to your right and left, but you're not allowed to organize at your level. You communicate communicate directly up with your superiors and directly down with your subordinates. That for Fayol was the ideal structure. Power in this, obviously, because it's hierarchical, is centralized. It travels from the top down. Fayol actually, he wasn't a cruel person or a punk. He believed that proper reward of employees was the best way to maximize efficiency. So he preached for proper remuneration, which is to say, paying what people deserved, because he felt that they worked harder and that they were well paid, which is pretty true. And finally, he taught that there were a set of attitudes that workers could have that would maximize the efficiency of the organization. Particularly that unity is strength, and that the goals, visions, and interests of the organization were superior than the goals, interests, and motivations of the individual. Right? So basically, the attitude that we should have in organized life is that the organized goal is better than the individual's goal, and that if everybody comes together with that in mind, all the rest of these things will fall into place. So, those are Taylor, Fayol, are two classic mechanistic thinkers, and that's a very brief treatment of some of their theories. Now, as you listen to that, you're probably thinking, okay, I mean, that sounds right. I've certainly been in an organization that didn't function well. I used to work for a golf grip making company, and there were some problems that they had, and sometimes people would come along and try to solve those problems using the scientific managing method. You know, how can we put the paint on the golf club, on the golf grip right? You know, this is, if you spray it like this, there's too much paint, you spend too much time wiping it off. If you spray it like this, then, you know, there's not enough paint, and it's all foggy, and, you know, the word doesn't pop out right. So where is the right distance that the spray nozzle should be? Certainly, that's a reality. But chances are you're also thinking, but there's more to an organization than just the outcome, right? There's a lot of stuff that's happening all along the way, and is it really all just structure, power, reward, and attitude? Or are there other things that are operating? If you're thinking that, then you're ready to move to the next stage. So, fast forward 40 or 50 years, there's been a lot of mechanistic theorization going on about the function of organizations. When we come to the age of human relations. So the classic study that kind of birthed the human relation movement is the study of illumination in a series of hawthorn plants. So basically they would set the workers to working, and they would mess with the illumination of the working conditions. So some of them, the lights would be turned on real high, some of them the lights would be turned on low, some of them the lights would fluctuate, one day they'd be high, one day they'd be middle, one day they'd be low. And they carefully studied people, and they watched their efficiency, and you know, they're doing all this documentation, and there are all these researchers there in the plant, and they get to the end, and they find that the efficiency of every single group is improved. Which is really weird, because, right, you'd expect one of the, maybe it's the high light, right? It's the people with a lot of light, they're going to perform better. Or maybe it's the people with the fluctuating light are going to perform better. No, they all perform better than before the researchers got there. And what the researchers realized is that their presence, their active involvement, their attention on the employees increased their productivity. That central thinking, that attention positively increases productivity, is the foundation of the human relations movement. So from there, you start to ask, okay, wait a second. As a manager, it's not only laying out the task in all of the right ways, it's relating to that person. In fact, it's fostering relationships that improves productivity. Now, I will say that some of the claims of human relation theory is a little far-fetched. There's not it isn't always the case that better relationships amongst the employees always increases productivity. Sometimes that's the case, sometimes not. And it is at times a little idealistic when looking back on things, because there are certain things that interfere with the ability of folks to foster excellent relationships, right? There are prevailing power structures inside organizations. There are expectations and ideologies that play a role in how these relationships get fostered. So you can't just go in and make everybody happy and everybody like each other, because there are a lot of things that are at work there. But that being said, that sensibility that relationships are key, in a way started up not only just the study of organizations, but started the study of organizational communication. Because now communication was no longer this thing that just happened when a manager figured out the right way of scooping coal. Communication was this problematic thing that could be good or bad, could be done right or wrong, could be done better or worse. And with that eye into relationships, the discipline evolved again. So enter the human resources era. And with the rise of the study of human resources comes with an attention to concepts of psychology and a lot of thought about humans and what the nature of human thinking is. So a classic human resources person is Maslow. You know Maslow, you've read about him in a lot of different books and his hierarchy of needs. And the idea behind Maslow, right, is that there are certain things, basic needs that need to be met before higher needs can get addressed. And as you knock out someone's desire for food and security and someone's desire for safety, then you start getting into their desire for acceptance and then ultimately their desire to be the best possible version of themselves. And inside an organization, you can sort of foster those things from the ground up and have a bunch of self-actualized workers. I'm not going to talk a lot about Maslow. I trust that you have heard about him before. So I'm going to focus on two human resources theorists that you probably haven't heard. One is this guy named McGregor. And he postulated a theory called Theory X and Theory Y. Now, McGregor basically believed that there were two kinds of managers that operated under two different assumptions. The first managers are Theory X managers. And Theory X managers basically believe that one, people don't like to work, right? People don't like work. They'll avoid it. They don't like responsibility. People don't like responsibility. And more or less that you have to force them in order to do what you want them to do. But McGregor also identified that there were different kinds of managers that operated under a different set of assumptions. And he called these managers Theory Y managers. And these Theory Y managers believed different things about humans. For one, they believed that work is natural. And that people, when sat in front of a task, generally kind of just did it. They also believed that people sought responsibility. And it wasn't so much that you had a bunch of workers who were cowering away from the responsibility that was out there, that they really actually did want to be invested and pour themselves into a thing. And taken together, that people, not just managers, are creative and capable of solving problems, whereas Theory X managers more assumed that creativity and problem solving was a trait of the management and not the average worker. So for McGregor, it's not so much that one of these is right and one of these is wrong, but that there are these different leadership styles. It's probably worth taking a moment and saying, which do I think is true? Do I think that work isn't something that people will do, and that that they don't like responsibility and they basically have to have it thrust on them? Or do you think that work is more natural, that people left to their own devices will labor and will seek responsibility? It's worth asking. And you certainly notice that there are some bosses that have this assumption or this assumption. These bosses tend to observe you a lot more and tend to kind of be on you, whereas the Theory Y manager is going to be a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more hands-off, because they probably think that you're going to do the work even though they're not there. So that's McGregor Theory X and Theory Y. Another human resources theory that I find particularly helpful is called Blake and Monton's managerial grid. Excuse me, Blake and Monton. And they created a thing called the managerial grid. Oftentimes we think about this distinction between people who are trying to care for their employees and people who are trying to get a lot of work done. And Blake and Monton believed that these things weren't on separate they were on separate continuums, and so that you could have high concern for people. So over here is concern for people, and that could be very low. You could care very little about your employees, or it could be very high. You could care a lot. And that there was also concern for production, which is to say that you can care a lot about how much work that you're getting done, meeting your bottom line, or you could care very little. And by separating these, instead of thinking them as an either or, you start to see that there's a grid here. It's why it's called the managerial grid, and that you can have a variety of positions. So you can care a lot about production and not a lot about people, right? Which would put you over here. And this is basically kind of an authoritative, do it or die organization. That's what you're going to get out of here. On the flip side, if you have no concern for production, if you don't really care, but you have a lot of concern for your workers, it's what they call the country club organization, where basically you're spending all of your time making sure your employees are happy, but you're not actually spending time making sure your employees are doing why they're employed. Now, there is a middle of the road here, which is to say that you can have some concern for production and some concern for your people. There's also an impoverished mode all the way over here, which is to say that some organizations, the management doesn't really care about people, and they also don't care about production. Maybe they're absent, they're not helping at all, whatever. And that finally, the ideal organization is a team organization, one that not only cares a lot about its people, but also cares a lot about its production. So this lays out all of these different possibilities. And, it makes sense. I've certainly worked in places that cared a lot about how I felt, but, weren't on me, and I've certainly worked for places that were really drilling you all the way. But this team thing is possible because, by having high concern for people, relating to the Hawthorne studies, right, you can build the right kind of relationships which will increase their productivity. But also, your workers are the ones who are doing the work. And so by building up your workers, you can improve their ability to work. Similarly, if Theory Y is correct and people like to work, having high concern for production and actually winning your games, getting your shit done, raises your ability to care for people and make them feel like the work that they do is meaningful. Anyway, I find this helpful, and we'll talk about the application of this theory in class, but it's worth having the basics down here now. So the final moment in the history of the study of organizational communication that we're going to discuss today is systems. So we started out looking at organizations as machines, and then we moved on to seeing them as more human enterprises. Finally, we get to this thinking that organizations are organisms inside environments. So while the prevailing metaphor in the early times was machines, and the prevailing metaphor in this mid-range was relationships, or what it means to be human, the prevailing metaphor here is kind of like an ecosystemic or thermodynamic metaphor, this idea that there's a complex system and that organization exists inside a broader environment. So a couple traits of systems. First, all systems exist in an environment. No organization exists alone. Oftentimes the study of organizations, they're pretty hasty to just talk about what's happening inside the organization, but without large attention to what's going on the boundaries and contextualizing the effort and the labor of the organization. Another trait of systems is that they are interdependent. Now, this is really important from an organizational perspective to understand, because sometimes people are a little foolish and they think that they can change one part of this organization, but that won't have broad influences on the rest of the way the organization plays out. So sometimes people will try to change the pay grades of the managers to keep them competitive with other like organizations, so their managers don't leave. But if the non-managers find out about their pay raise, and the non-managers didn't get a pay raise also, they're going to get ticked, and there are going to be problems. So pay throughout the entire organization is interdependent. That's just one example. Systems also generally have goals that they labor towards. Think about from an organism's perspective, right? As an organism, I have goals, right? I have to eat, I have to move, but then I have higher goals, like, setting up my life and being surrounded by people that I love. And those goals drive me as an organism, and they all are interdependent, right? My goal of having a house is dependent on other goals, such as employment and also eating, right? So if I fail to eat, then I'll also fail to have a house. Another trait of systems is that they are ultimately processes. And this process focus is really important. It's not so much that organizations have strict realities. This is what's real about the organization. It's more that they're ongoing, transformative processes. And that these are dynamics that sometimes have feedback loops, and the ultimate output of one particular process can come around and influence the input, right? If you think about customers, right? You feed this customer, and a naive vision of a restaurant is to feed people, right? But the real goal is to feed them in a way that makes them come back, right? So to turn customers into repeat customers. That's to recognize that there's a process, which is people are making decisions about where they're going to eat, and if you feed them really well, they'll come back, right? But an even more nuanced attention to that process is to recognize that they not only make decisions about where they eat, but they influence other people who make decisions about where they eat. So the real goal is not only to feed them, and not only to feed them well enough that they'll come back, but feed them well enough to make it so that they'll make other people come, right? So it's an attention to that process, right? That it's not about the individual meal, but it's about a broader process as you pursue your goals, which are interdependent on each other, and network out with the environment that kind of creates the feedback that creates organizations. An important thing to keep in mind with systems theory, just real basically, is that organizations have input, which are all the things that are coming into the organization. So that's all the resources, all the manpower, all the ideas, everything that's flooding in. You have throughput, which are all the internal processes, the pay, the best practices, the culture of the organization, all of that stuff. And then finally you get output. And that output are the actual products, the paid employees, the actioned ideas, the inventions, the satisfied customers, whatever. So from a systems perspective, it's often very helpful to say, okay, what are the things coming in, what are the things happening inside, and what are the things going out? And then when you start to have this vision of an organization, then you start saying, oh wow, we don't have enough outputs, and that we knew. But the problem might not be with our throughput. It might be that we don't have enough input. Or it might be, wow, it seems that there is this input that's trying to come into the organization, but because of certain rules, we've prevented it from making as big of an impact as it possibly can. That's a really very brief introduction to systems theory, but it'll do for now. Now, as we conclude, it's probably worth asking, why all of these options? What is the point of discussing these 4 different movements through the study of communication in organizations, from mechanistics to human relations to human resources to systems? So there are a couple of reasons. One, it's worth knowing the history. It's worth knowing the history of the evolution of the discipline. But if you're not an academic, that's probably not a very compelling answer. So I'll move on to one that is a little bit more meaningful. Part of the awesome thing about the study of organizations is that no one theory is perfect. No one theory is absolutely true. And no one theory is exactly what you need all of the time. Because all of the theories are in a way partial. And so simultaneously, they're often true in some way, but they're also limited in other ways. And so while it's very valuable to look at an organization and say, okay, it's a well-oiled machine. What needs to be oiled a little bit better? But when I look at it that way, it's going to highlight certain realities, the processes of production, the practices, in a way, the motivations and the effort. But it's going to limit your ability to see, well, the people, right? But if you focus in only on the people and say, okay, how much does Sally like Bob? What does Bob think about Joe? You can get bogged down in the people, which is really great because it can actually improve the relationships. But if you don't see the overlying managerial issues, then you'll be too focused on this stuff, right? So you come up to this managerial level and say, okay, well, I have this option and this option. I'm going to see it this way and that way. But if you're only a managerialist, then you'll never actually see how your organization fits inside the structure of the entire environment around you. And if you're only ever looking at the environment and the systematic things, you may miss other things which we'll talk about later, such as the culture that exists inside the organization, gendered, race, class, age-based issues where the organization is failing and sometimes even perpetuating stereotypes. And so one of the things that's awesome about the study of organizational communication is that all of these things are useful and all of them are flawed. And that's why you need many of them. Which brings me to the last and ultimately the real point of learning all of this stuff. It's to increase what's called your requisite variety, or your theoretical complexity. And by that I mean to say that when you're looking at a problem, that there are a lot of different ways of even identifying what the problem is. And that all of these different theories that we've started to discuss, and actually we'll discuss over the next couple of weeks, they're options, they're tools that go into a toolkit. And so you might show up, you might join a political organization because you think that there needs to be real political change on an issue. And when you get there, you might start to notice that there are problems. And no one theory that I ever teach you is going to be the right one to say, oh, this is how we solve it. You need to kind of stay on your toes and look around and go, okay, what's the issue here? Because the issue might be as simple as, we're all doing this differently and there's one right way to do it and we need to figure out what it is and teach everyone. Sometimes the answer really is mechanistic. But there are other times when it's not so much about the one right way of doing it, it's not about a process, it's about how the organization is coming together or how the organization is networking with its environment broadly. Which is why it's worth learning a handful of these things. A tool belt is only worth having if you've got a lot of tools in it. And any good crafter knows that if you're going to make something, you've got to have the right tool for the right job. And if we're going to craft a better world, then we need to look at the way that world is organized in a lot of different ways. Thanks. See you on Tuesday.